Okay, well, good afternoon. My name is Colin Orians, and I am the director of the Environmental Studies program here at Tufts University. And we bring you this weekly lecture series, the Hope Cunningham Environmental Lectures. And this series is made possible by the generous donations of Tufts alumni siblings Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke and their families. This is the last one of the year, so thank you for all of you who have been coming each week. Welcome back. For those who are new, welcome, and we hope to see you again in the fall. If you would like to receive alerts about the lecture series, you can sign up at the link that we're going to put into the chat. And if you are a student and want to receive the student newsletter, you can also go to the second link that's part of what's going into the chat. If you would also like to view watch a previous one, as most of our talks are recorded, you can click on the link that we're also putting in the chat. So a few ground rules. The chat is disabled, so we want to have people put their questions into the Q&A, and then I will moderate those questions at the end. And as I said before, the recording, we will record this and post it to the environmental websites, and you can watch those recordings at your leisure or share them with others. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tufts Professor Dr. Caleb Scoville. Caleb is an assistant professor in sociology and a faculty affiliate in the environmental studies program. He received a BA in political science and economics from Portland State University, a master's in political science at UC San Diego, and then in 2014, and then a master's and a PhD in sociology at UC Berkeley in 2017 and 2020, respectively. He arrived at Tufts this past September, and we really can't wait to interact with him in person. This has been quite the Zoom year. So like his academic background, his scholarly work is very interdisciplinary. His research explores the dynamic interplay among extractive infrastructure, sort of how humans are altering the environment, science, law, the public sphere, controversy in response to water scarcity and biodiversity loss. His work has received a number of awards for the American Sociological Association sections on environmental sociology, science, knowledge, and technology, and animals in society, as well as the Pacific Sociological Association and the University of California, Berkeley's Department of Sociology. Our collective activities, meaning humanity's collective activities, threaten the existence of many species. Multiple species over the course of this year have argued that we need to give nature a place at the table. And Caleb really thinks deeply about what is nature? What is the meaning of nature? When our very actions change the nature of nature and creates new conflict in the process, how do we collectively work to conserve species? Today, he will explore how a small California fish is transforming our worldview. The title of his talk is A Stupid Little Fish, Science, Law, and the Politics of the Environmental Decline in California. Welcome to Tufts, Caleb. The screen is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. So I believe you can all see my screen now. So thank you so much for having me today, in particular to Coco and Colin for inviting me to speak, and of course to you all for attending. I'm really excited to talk about my research. So I'd like to start with our former president, who in one of his first interviews after being diagnosed with COVID-19, complained to Sean Hannity of Fox News that California has to ration water because it pours its supply into the sea to care for, quote, a certain tiny little fish. Now, some commentators pointed to the bizarreness of these claims, but this actually wasn't the first time that Donald Trump waded into this territory. Back in June 2016, then presidential candidate Trump addressed a crowd in Fresno with the claim that, I quote, "there is no drought. It is so ridiculous where they're taking the water and shoving it out to sea to protect a certain kind of 3-inch fish. If I win, believe me, we're going to start opening up the water so that you can have your farmers survive." Now, California was, of course, in its 5th year of severe drought, the deepest in recent memory, but this statement was not without resonance and not without precedent. 2 years prior, although already years into that same drought, Devin Nunes, the congressman representing that same audience, had blamed California's water woes on a certain stupid little fish on the House floor. And earlier still in 2009, Sean Hannity pointed to the, I quote, incredible suffering in this region because of a government that has put the interest of a 2-inch delta smelt minnow before the people of California. All of this serves as an introduction to our humble protagonist, the delta smelt, an endangered species of fish found only in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, or as it is known locally, simply the Delta. What you know as the San Francisco Bay is the outlet of the Delta, where water from California's major river systems makes its way to the Pacific Ocean. And the Delta, again, is its sole habitat. It's both the largest estuary in the Western Hemisphere and the source of water for more than 27 million people and 3 million acres of irrigated farmland. The US's most productive agricultural region and the state's southern metropolises wouldn't exist in anything like their current form if it weren't for re-engineering the Delta for productive purposes. And the Delta smelt is listed under the Endangered Species Act, arguably the most powerful environmental law in the United States. The law is so powerful because it operates as a strict prohibition against actions that jeopardize the continued existence of biological species. Because the Delta smelt only lives in close proximity to the pumps in the Delta that irrigate the southern half of California, the species protected status has resulted in controversial curtailments of water delivered to Southern California cities, and even more importantly, the US's primary agricultural hub, the Southern Central Valley. Roughly 80% of water used by humans in California, after all, is agricultural. So to many, California water politics fits into a well-rehearsed tale that the modern relationship with nature is disenchanted. That is, our relationship to nature is characterized by calculation, control, and ultimately domination. In this rendition, there are those who want to extract value from nature, and pushing against them are defenders of nature's intrinsic value. So this framing suggests that those who rail against the Delta smelt are doing so out of an extractive interest, and those who seek to protect it from extinction stand in opposition to that extraction. This is a story that's about modernity and nature that in fact goes back to at least Max Weber, a foundational figure in the discipline of sociology. And again, the story is that we used to see nature as inherently meaningful and sacred, and now we don't. Instead, nature is now an object of calculation, control, and ultimately domination. Now, for obvious reasons, the disenchantment of nature has been an influential concept in environmental scholarship. Yet Weber provided another idea that has not received as much attention in environmental research: the proliferation of many distinct value spheres, what later social theorists would refer to as the condition of differentiation. According to this view, modernity does not merely involve a narrowing of vision, in which nature is a simple object of extraction. It involves a multiplication of visions. The analysis of differentiation centers on how modern society makes nature available to us in many distinct ways at the same time. These different value spheres, Weber argued, stand in irreconcilable conflict because there is no universal method for evaluating the relative value of values themselves. Now, accordingly, my suggestion then is not to begin with the case of the Delta smelt as a ready-made evidence of the domination of nature or conflict about the distribution of a resource, that is water, but to understand all of the different social domains that see nature in different ways that are implicated in this controversy. What is visible to us at first is a public sphere controversy. People like Donald Trump arguing about the Delta smelt in a polarized media environment. And in order for the Delta smelt to create trouble in the world of California water, it had to be protected by law. Otherwise, there would be nothing to argue about. But the law cannot regulate nature without the help of scientists who tell us, in this case, that there is a species called the Delta smelt and that it is being harmed by California's extractive water system. And of course, underlying all of this is California's water infrastructure itself. These are all domains that see nature in different ways. Nature is at once a productive resource, an object of knowledge, an object of regulation, and a topic of controversy. Of course, all these domains are implicated in one actually existing biophysical environment. And the trouble is that we encounter that one environment through many domains that see it in very different ways. A further trouble with having many different social domains, such as science, law, and politics, that see the same underlying natural environment in different ways, is that an action originating from one of these domains can have effects that are felt in others. We don't simply see nature through these different domains, we actively intervene. And because the natural environment is more complex than any single domain can fully account for, our interventions inevitably overflow and implicate other social domains. I call this process the intervention cascade. And this schematic shows two domains for simplicity. But my point here is that in the case of the natural environment, many domains share jurisdiction over a common external object, yet they see that object, nature, in different and often contradictory ways. And consequently, interventions from one domain can overflow and trigger interventions from others, setting off cascades throughout society. So my study of the case of the Delta smelt shows that the conflict isn't simply about the distribution of water consequent to the domination of nature. It is better understood as a series of interventions and overflows among domains which see nature in different ways, yet are implicated in the same underlying environment. The links between these domains are not simple, they're not linear, and because these domains see nature in different ways, they often have ironic consequences. So I'm going to illustrate two of these links in my time today. First, I will show that rather than simply being driven to near extinction by California's water infrastructure, the Delta smelt as an object of knowledge was produced by that very infrastructural intervention in the first place. In other words, we come to know that there is a Delta smelt through the very process of endangering it. And second, rather than the controversy over the Delta smelt being a simple effect of various parties pursuing their interest, the controversy is better understood as a process through which many people came to have an interest in California water politics at all. And if that's confusing at first, don't worry, we're going to go through each of these steps step by step in my remaining time. So now I want to discuss the first link in this intervention cascade, showing how an infrastructural intervention into the natural environment overflowed into conservation science. This is important because in order for a species to qualify for protected status under the Endangered Species Act, 3 bits of knowledge must be assembled. First, we need a taxonomic classification of a unique species that might face endangerment. Second, we need evidence that a species distribution, what a species distribution is sort of spatially. And third, we need evidence that the prevalence of the species is declining over time, such that it is in danger of becoming extinct. So I'll show how all of this knowledge emerged out of the process of re-engineering California's river systems, the very intervention that contributed most directly to the Delta smelt's decline. And ironically, then, re-engineering California's river systems for extractive ends produced knowledge of nature that would become to be mobilized against those extractive imperatives. And I'll show how this happened by tracking fisheries management and fisheries science before and after California's major water projects were built. So let's start with how the state saw California's fisheries in California before the modern water delivery system in the state was built. So in 1911, the California State Legislature authorized the California Fish and Game Commission to police wholesale fish markets and report on fish caught and sold. So for roughly the first half of the 20th century, this was the state's sole method of systematically objectifying fishery stocks. Commercial actors and regulators alike reported fish in categories relevant to market transactions. This is what historians of science call a vernacular taxonomy. So for instance, while there were several then identifiable biological species of smelt that could be found in fish markets, in published fish and game reports, they were all simply referred to as smelt. Smelt simply referred to small fishes with similar commercial uses and visual characteristics. Only fish sold at markets were systematically reported, as opposed to attempts to count fish actually living in particular bodies of water. And only counts of fish were reported, as opposed to preserving physical specimens that could be used in later scientific studies. So the disconnect between fisheries science and management is also evidence in the history of ichthyology. The origins of the modern taxonomy of smelts dates back to David Starr Jordan's expeditions to Japan on the USS Albatross in the first decades of the 20th century. And here, knowledge of fish was embedded in international relations, not in the management of local resources. So Starr Jordan's junior associate, Carl Hubbs, drew upon resources from these expeditions to publish his 1925 revision of the Osmerid fishes of the North Atlantic. And here, referring to the species classification that included what we now call delta smelt, he writes, Hypomesis olidus, which corresponds to the common name pond smelt, ranges from the mountain lakes of central Japan and the shores of coastwise freshwaters of northern Japan, northward through Kamchatka to the Arctic shores of North America, then southward along the east side of the North Pacific as far as the upper or brackish portions of the San Francisco Bay. So because there weren't systematic sampling programs of fisheries at the time, the stock of samples that he drew on included few from California itself. Most of the specimens he had access to were collected in sporadic expeditions around the Pacific Rim. So at least in the case of smelts, in the first decades of the 20th century, taxonomic science was divorced from fisheries management in California. Now, re-engineering California's river systems in the mid-20th century would permanently alter the relationship between fisheries management and biological knowledge in the state. The figure on the right shows the cumulative capacity of water storage in California over time. So from the 1940s to the 1970s, the state and federal governments cooperated to completely transform California's river systems. Together, the Central Valley Project and State Water Project irrigate much of the southern half of the state by diverting the rivers of the north through the Delta. So massive pumps were installed in the Delta, and hundreds of miles of aqueducts and canals were built to move that water to farms and cities in the southern half of the state. These were the largest infrastructural projects undertaken in human history at the time. And not only does re-engineering rivers alter their physical states, but it reconfigures the relations among interested social actors. Fish and game agencies, pursuing their own fiscal and professional interests, were concerned about the effects of this infrastructural intervention. Accordingly, the first systematic survey of the aquatic environment of the Delta was published in 1950 as an attempt to evaluate the effects of installing a federal pumping plant. The study's object of concern was commercially and recreationally valuable fisheries, but the report includes data on other fish incidentally caught as well. This included what was then referred to as the pond smelt, the species then understood to be widely distributed around the Pacific Rim. Crucially, rather than simply counting fish, as in markets, government biologists also systematically collected and preserved specimens. And the state of California followed up with its own study of the Delta to evaluate the effects of a second pumping plant. So whereas commercial catch reports were previously the only comprehensive source of information on California's fisheries, the water projects resulted in direct surveys of aquatic environments. Because this new form of data collection was not mediated by commercial actors, the broad taxonomy of commerce, for example, the general category smelt in markets, was no longer the most relevant. And whereas commercial reports produced only counts of fish, direct sampling produced specimens that could be preserved for future scientific study. Thus, while in the first half of the 20th century, fisheries managers in California merely drew on biological knowledge to inform their own interventions, in the second half, taxonomists could in turn draw on the specimen collections produced by fisheries managers to inform their own research. And what followed was the disruption of the taxonomic order. So Canadian ichthyologist Donald McAllister didn't have to make an expedition to California's Delta to write his 1963 taxonomic revision, which includes the first distinction between the pond smelt and the Delta smelt. Instead, he inherited the systematically collected and preserved specimens produced in the process of re-engineering California's rivers. In contrast with the earlier reliance on samples from diplomatic missions, he simply cites the water project studies and relies on specimens collected and preserved as part of them. McAllister showed that far from being a species distributed throughout the Pacific Rim, the Delta smelt was in fact a unique species that was geographically confined to the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And so an extractive infrastructural intervention had overflowed to make possible a new, more fine-grained biological taxonomy. Now, with its new status as a unique species, the Delta smelt remained obscure, but it was now a step closer to having real policy significance. Fish and game agencies continued surveying the Delta to track the health of valuable recreational fisheries. They still only picked up Delta smelt incidentally. Peter Moyle, now the foremost expert on the Delta smelt, first took an interest in the species in the 1970s when writing along for those same surveys for his own research. And in an interview, he told me that he was initially struck with the Delta smelt's abundance, but that by the late 1980s, he noticed a troubling decline in their numbers and decided to file a petition to have the species listed as endangered. And it was finally listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1993. So this is how a scientific intervention came to overflow into the domain of law. In retrospect, Moyle likened the policy influence of his work to, I quote, stirring up an ant's nest. And the reason why can be seen in its critical habitat here on the screen, which is the center of California's water distribution system. So my claim is that an infrastructural intervention overflowed into conservation science. Rather than simply contributing to the Delta smelt's decline, building California's water projects also resulted in the emergence of the Delta smelt as a very object of knowledge, and by extension, environmental concern. If California's water projects were not built, the Delta smelt might not be recognized as a unique species today. And if it were, we certainly would know a lot less about it, and whatever knowledge we did have would not be politically consequential. Now, of course, endangerment is not simply a scientific concept, it's a legal one. So with the listing of the Delta smelt as endangered, it became federal policy for the operation of California's water distribution system to avoid killing it. This posed a challenge that contributed to the reorganization of the governance of water resources in California. So elsewhere in my project, I take a deep dive into the complex relationship between science and law. And I don't have time to present that work in detail today, but I want to make a few quick points before turning into the subsequent public sphere controversy that I began with in this talk. So first is a simple quantitative relationship. We see here on the top pane that there has been an explosion of scientific activity on the Delta smelt as the species has approached extinction, which is represented on the bottom pane. So one reason for this increased scrutiny is that after being listed under the Endangered Species Act, the species became understood as an indicator species for the health of the Delta ecosystem as a whole. In the context of a multi-billion-dollar conservation program, the goal of this program was to improve environmental conditions in the Delta without reducing the amount of water extracted from the Delta. As an indicator species, the Delta smelt's prevalence was used to calibrate that policy and evaluate its success. However, attempts to save the species without costly curtailments in water conveyance ultimately failed. And as the species declined, the Delta smelt became an indicator, not merely for the health of an ecosystem, but for the efficacy of a multi-billion-dollar government program. And the upshot was a now infamous federal court decision in 2007, which is known as the Wanger decision, named for Judge Oliver Wanger, shown here. And I'll turn to the aftermath of this case shortly. Experts acknowledge now that the Delta smelt isn't an indicator species anymore for the simple reason that, in the words of one of my interviewees, is just about gone, so it doesn't indicate anything. The law still, of course, prohibits directly harming the Delta smelt, but the scientists argue that bringing the species back from the brink would require more radical interventions than the law requires. And the situation is further complicated by the fact that the vast majority of the remaining Delta smelts in existence live not in the estuary, but here in a genetically managed laboratory population with an increasingly precarious link to the wild. So recent estimates suggest that the captive population may be as much as 50 times as large as the wild one, raising problems that the Endangered Species Act wasn't designed to deal with. But I'd like to step away from the technical world of laboratories and estuaries and turn to what happened when the legal intervention to protect the Delta smelt from California's water infrastructure overflowed into the public sphere. And this requires considering how the public sphere operates today. So in recent decades, the environment has taken on increasing partisan significance in American politics. Just consider that the Endangered Species Act passed Congress nearly unanimously and was signed enthusiastically by Republican President Richard Nixon. No such bipartisan space exists today. Environmental controversies now take shape in a highly polarized public sphere. While most observers see California's water wars as a brute material conflict over a limited resource, the case of the Delta smelt shows how important symbolic struggles are in this context as well. So I'm going to show that we can't understand the meaning of the Delta smelt controversy by looking to its effects on California water policy alone. And my central claim in this part of the talk is that the Delta smelt controversy is not merely a clash of pre-existing interests. Rather, the controversy reveals how social divisions are actively articulated, reinforced, and maintained. So in this case, it shows how conservative partisan elites use the Delta smelt to enroll California's water wars into America's culture wars. So in a world where this conflict was simply about the distribution of water, we would expect social reactions to map onto direct reductions in water supply associated with the Delta smelt's protection. So here I'm referring to a systematic scientific analysis that breaks down the variety of factors limiting water conveyance from the Delta over the last decade. And there are a couple of important things I'd like to point out. First, among environmental regulations, protections of the Delta smelt are actually the smallest factor. And second, there is actually another set of Endangered Species Act protections that has a larger impact, which includes Chinook salmon native to the Delta. So protections of the Delta smelt are only one source of water curtailment and are responsible for a small set of restrictions in relative terms. Now, of course, in absolute terms, this is still a significant quantity of water, and the effects of regulations are not equally distributed. So this grounds the following question. What is the relationship between the public sphere controversy surrounding the Delta smelt and its actual impacts on water conveyance associated with regulations protecting the species? I took the numbers from that same study I showed the figure from before, and I tested their correlations by water year with a series of measures of social interest in the Delta smelt. So this includes seeing if the numbers of news articles published mentioning the Delta smelt, the relative Google search interest in the Delta smelt with Google Trends, the mentions of the Delta smelt on Twitter, or mentions of the Delta smelt in the congressional record correlate with the limits on water extracted from the Delta associated with the Delta smelt's protections. And in all cases, we see either no clear correlation or a modest negative correlation, the opposite relationship the water wars thesis would predict. And the results are similar if we use numbers for the total Endangered Species Act protections of all species in the Delta, including salmon, or a measure of total water exports, which is sort of a measure of dryness, suggesting that public concern appears to be totally disconnected from the flows of water. So this brings us to an alternative way of thinking about the case. What if the controversy operates according to a political and media logic that is basically divorced from water policy? So in these figures, I plot the social indicators against each other. And in all cases, we see a clear linear relationship with much higher levels of correlation. In some cases, almost perfect. So we have evidence to suggest that ordinary people's interest via Google searches and Twitter activity, print media interest via news articles published, and elite political interest via mentions in the congressional record basically move in lockstep with each other, but not according to the flows of water. So this, I think, supports the view that while media and political actors have certainly taken advantage of opportunities within the world of California water policy and politics, in the last decade at least, the controversy has taken on a life of its own. As such, I think it's important to understand the meaning of the Delta smelt controversy on its own terms. Once events in the domain of law and science overflowed into the public sphere, they took on a life of their own. So a common error is to understand the controversy as a simple reflection of material interests in the world of California water. And so to provide a corrective of this treatment, I'm going to focus primarily on the way the Delta smelt is portrayed in traditional print media. And to do so, I built a corpus of over 3,000 news articles mentioning Delta smelt. So it's important to note that news does follow substantively important policy events. Here we see a small spike in media interest when it was listed under the Endangered Species Act. and an explosion of interest with the Wanger decision in 2007. Labeled in blue are op-eds, editorials, and letters to the editor, and straight news articles are in red. However, while the Wanger decision was an important media event in its own right, in what follows, I want to show you that overall, the shape of the controversy has less to do with water than we might initially think. So to conduct this analysis, I identified 680 opinion pieces mentioning the delta smelt, and I read them, and I coded them across several qualitative variables. The first was their position on environmental protections. So I classified them into 3 categories: those that take a positive stance toward environmental protections, those that are ambiguous, and these were often calling for balance or berating politicians for not solving the problem, and then those that take a negative stance towards environmental protections. So there's many in each category, but the anti-environmental category is the largest. I also coded them for whether or not their principal topic was California water or not, and unsurprisingly, most were. When you bring these variables together, important associations emerge. So compared to pro-environmental pieces, anti-environmental opinions mentioning the delta smelt were more than 6 times more likely not to be principally about California water. In other words, defenders of the environment are likely to argue about the delta smelt in concrete terms, whereas opponents are much more likely to use the delta smelt as an example or an illustration of some other problem. So this suggests that the delta smelt has much more cultural resonance for opponents of environmental protections. In other words, its meaning is not simply about water. So what does this actually look like? Well, here's one example of how the delta smelt has been woven seamlessly into broader partisan narratives. The writer, a resident of Florida, not California, says, "I'm a Tea Party member, I think. I don't have a card, a secret handshake, or a tattoo, but I go to meetings and I agree with most of what Tea Partiers believe in, like small government and small taxes, and that the government ain't my mama and daddy. I wish we did have the power that a recent letter writer gave us credit for, but we only have Fox backing us sometimes. Want to know where the power lies? And it does lie. Check out the delta smelt. The environmentalists want to cut off the water supply to farmers in the Central Valley in California because of a few smelts." Now, as I mentioned before, the delta smelt accounts for a significantly smaller proportion of water curtailment than its larger and more charismatic counterpart, Chinook salmon, which is also an endangered species native to the delta. So given that protections of these species are indistinguishable to lay people and actually most experts, I decided to count which opinion pieces that mention the delta smelt also mention salmon or the specification Chinook. And while most do not, over a third do mention species together. So breaking these down by position, a striking pattern emerges. Pro-environmental pieces tend to mention the species together. And the vast majority of anti-environmental opinion articles do not. So if you're going to denounce environmental protections of the delta smelt, it's better not to mention its more charismatic cousin. And rhetorically, it's easy to see why. The delta smelt's small size and lack of charisma is often mobilized by political elites, including the likes of Sarah Palin, for whom it was a 3-inch bait fish, and similarly for Ted Cruz, who fantasized out loud about eating them with cheese and crackers in 2016. Another important factor is to consider where the op-eds are being published. Now, it shouldn't be surprising that the vast majority are from California publications. This is exacerbated, however, by my sampling procedure. I started with a major news database, and then I manually added several major California newspapers that it excluded to make sure to get enough regional diversity within California. I didn't do this for other regions, so I'm undoubtedly missing many articles outside of California. But even with these potential omissions, we can see it's only by bringing in opinion articles published outside of the state that we can see why the debate appears to be tilted toward anti-environmental voices. Opinions published outside of California are much more negative about environmental protections, despite the only material interest at play being in California. This suggests that the controversy's political appeal is driven, at least in part, by its resonance with national political discourses, not merely a play of local interests. And here, the raw counts show that if we were to remove all of the publications outside of California, there would actually be fewer anti-environmental pieces than pro-environmental ones in the corpus. And further, pieces published outside of California are several times more likely not to be about California water at all, instead using the delta smelt as an example of or illustration of something else. So writers outside of California are more likely to discuss the delta smelt in isolation from its broader context and are more likely to link it with other issues. How did the delta smelt become resonant on a national level, despite only concerning Californians materially? To answer this question, it is helpful to turn away from the content of the articles to measures of public interest themselves. So this figure shows monthly Google interest in the delta smelt relative over time. And if you're like me, your eye is being drawn to that large peak in September 2009, which corresponds not to an event in California water, but to Sean Hannity's expose on the delta smelt. Hannity's focus on the delta smelt brought the species out of obscurity, making it a symbol for all that was supposedly wrong with California, with liberals, and with environmentalism. And this outsized focus from the right side of the political spectrum subsequently stuck. Over the next decade, which is the period we have data for, Fox News mentioned the delta smelt on a total of 103 distinct days, with very little coverage by CNN or MSNBC. These data are from the Stanford Cable TV News Analyzer. Thus, I think it is safe to say that Hannity and others did not merely report on a controversy, he helped create it. In this sense, I understand him to be playing the role of an entrepreneur of political division. This work makes it possible for people who are in no way materially impacted by the delta smelt to feel like they have a stake in the problem. Relatedly, Congressman Devin Nunes, who appeared on Hannity's special, refers to the delta smelt as not merely a stupid little fish, but their stupid little fish. And with this move, the delta smelt controversy becomes a medium whereby California water politics becomes enrolled into a much larger national politics of us versus them. So my suggestion is that we view the delta smelt controversy not simply as an episode in California's so-called water wars, but as an instance where problems in the world of California water came to overflow into America's broader culture wars. Within this context, the delta smelt is a political symbol. Its meaning is that, roughly, out-of-touch liberals in faraway cities care more about their stupid little fish than they care about ordinary people like you. And this meaning is an achievement of skilled entrepreneurs of political division. They did not invent the problem out of whole cloth. They took advantage of the species' status as an uncharismatic microfauna and of real events in California water policy that unwittingly overflowed into their domain. Owing to their work, the species is now part of a broader, emotionally charged partisan politics that has little to do with the actual flows of water. And thinking of it in this way places the delta smelt in relation to a broader tactical repertoire of anti-environmental politics and climate change denial that exploits and hardens emotional sources of cultural resentment at the expense of thorny policy decisions. We saw something similar in the aftermath of February's deadly storms in Texas, which were blamed incorrectly on green energy. It's a strategy of blaming environmental problems on environmentalists via evocative political symbolism. Now, zooming back out to where I started, the broader point I'm making is that instead of taking environmental controversies as ready-made and self-evident in their meaning, we should look to how they come to be through the intersection of various domains that see nature in very different ways. Instead of simply mapping claims directly onto material interests, we should look to how interventions in one domain overflow into others and take on lives of their own. So today I focused primarily on two parts of the story. First, the very object of the conflict, the delta smelt, only emerged as a discrete and knowable entity via re-engineering California's river systems. This shows that extractive infrastructure can actually enable environmental science. Second, I've argued that the subjects of the public sphere controversy should not be understood as a one-to-one correspondence between material and cultural interests. Rather, the controversy is also an important cause of the very constituencies that claim to have an interest in California water politics at all. Beyond the specifics of the case, I propose that the study shows why we should go beyond the disenchantment and domination of nature to focus on the condition of differentiation, the coexistence of many domains that see nature in different ways, and the ways that those domains come to intersect concretely. Looking forward, I want to propose that we should expect climate change not to merely exacerbate struggles over the distribution of resources, which it is and it will, but rather it may also exacerbate conflicts across domains variously implicated in the same natural environment, yet reacting to the same underlying problems in totally contradictory ways. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kayla. That was really fascinating. I want to encourage the audience to put questions in the Q&A. I want to start off, your talk reminded me of my time growing up in Seattle, where the controversy then was the spotted owl. You know, you care more about the spotted owl than you do care about the jobs of loggers. And so it seems to me that there's been a long history of sort of, can I call it a boundary object, the smelt, the owl, kind of an object that gets sort of becomes so politicized. Have you seen effective counter boundary frames that come from the environmental groups? Like, what do you see as being the counter that either is trying to sort of bring people together or is trying to be as forceful on the other side?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great parallel, Colin. And I'll just say that my interest, that I didn't go into with when studying the delta smelt, but that I want to do after is to write a longer history of these symbols and how sort of environmental objects become enrolled into broader sort of contexts of political division that extend beyond the immediate material conflict. And I think the spotted owl is a paradigmatic case, which was actually cited in Patrick Buchanan's famous culture wars speech back in the early 90s. So the environment has always been a culture war object, but that history is yet to be written. As for a counter symbol, I think it's a little tough with species, with endangered species. I mean, I think one point I'll make is that there's a lot of critical environmental literature that, for good reason, points to sort of problems with focusing on charismatic megafauna and flagship species. And I think the case of the delta smelt, although the spotted owl is of course very charismatic and very cute, but certain cases might point to sort of cautionary tales on the other side of focusing on perhaps just as ecologically important, but maybe not the same as, say, the bald eagle, which of course was a flagship for the very Endangered Species Act itself. So that of course has patriotic symbolism and is something that Americans, I think, across the political spectrum would not want to see extinct. I do think that symbolic politics knows no partisanship, right? So I'm hesitant to say that the delta smelt could be rescued, as much as I hope it can, as a symbol for environmental advocates. But if we look to cases that are very different, like Standing Rock, there are moments where environmentalists were able to articulate continuity among a diverse set of constituencies through a sort of symbolic event or pipeline or conflict, bringing in sort of indigenous voices and veterans and to sort of invoke a sort of moral vision for environmentalism that I think was not easily co-optable by their opponents. So I think those are cases that we should look at more carefully with an eye to symbolic politics. And I know there was a lot of important work on those topics, but those would be, I think, important comparisons to make to the case of the delta smelt.
You're mentioning about the Endangered Species Act of having teeth. It's one of the few laws that has good teeth in the environment. And my colleague, Michael Reed, often talks about its value, but also its controversy. And so I'm wondering if there are alternative laws that might be effective, that aren't about a small little fish, right? That could help unify, as opposed to put the focus on a singular species. And yet the singular species approach is what's so effective in our society.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm qualified to say which conservation approaches are best. That's probably something I'd rather pose to you. but in terms of the tensions between science and law, right? That's something that I've seen a lot in this case, right? The conservation scientists that I've studied and learned from, and been in dialogue with for years to this case, often are frustrated by the outsized focus, not only within the media, but within the sort of scientific realm and the policy realm on the delta smelt. You sort of have to mention the delta smelt because it's listed. It becomes sort of a more important scientific object. And there's entire sort of careers and centers that are built largely, my career itself is an example of this, around this object that becomes important in part because of its legal status. And of course, environmental advocates and conservation scientists care about the delta smelt, but they care about the broader ecosystem in which it's embedded, perhaps even more. So the smelt is often sort of a proxy through which we can, as an indicator species, try to affect the quality of that ecosystem. And that's the way the Endangered Species Act, that's the hope, is that we'll be able to align the two. But I'm not sure if the delta smelt yet has seen itself to be a case where that alignment has worked out particularly well. And I know people are trying very hard, but given the role of its extractive infrastructure and also impending climate change, it's a real tough case.
Yeah, preserving a species on the brink is really hard. So Atticus wrote, "It seems like our 20th century conservation science policy law system has broadly been too backwards looking, leading to too little knowledge and protection too late. Is there a way to push the system to take action prior to the point where a species or ecosystem is nearly unrecoverable? Are those notoriously costly and much complained about environmental review requirements for infrastructure building helpful in this regard?"
Wow, that's a great question, and I'm not totally sure, but I do think a comparative approach might be helpful here. So I'm not a comparative sociologist, but there are folks who have studied comparative biodiversity law across different countries. The Endangered Species Act is, of course, not the only law looking in the world. So maybe Colin, you would have reflections on this, on other models. But it's tough. I mean, I don't know. The trouble with anticipatory work like this is that, at least from my perspective doing this work, is that you often only sort of know what nature is through the process of engaging with it in ways that might not be good for nature. So, the water projects are part of why, and the water projects meaning California's water system, which is extractive in nature, and that isn't a moral term. That's just they take a lot of water out of Delta. That's part of why the Delta is so well studied, right? Is because we extract so much out of it. So we didn't really have a concept of the Delta ecosystem, which of course, existed as an ecosystem before that. Those water projects in a much healthier way, until we started treating it as an object of extraction. So I'm not saying that's an eternal law of our relationship with the environment, but historically, our ways of knowing nature have often been bound up with our ways of messing with it. So yeah, I think those sort of reviews, environmental reviews, of course, people are going to complain about them. Perhaps are a helpful way to do that, but I think it's not quite my jurisdiction to say which is more policy effective because I don't know.
Your point is really well taken, though, because what you're getting at is, until there's a system that is really desirable for another reason, the money, the research that goes into studying it is going to be a drop in the bucket, right? And then once you decide, you realize it's desirable, there's environmental impact statements that happen, data start coming in. The National Science Foundation has been pushing long-term ecological data, and they have certain sites where they're trying to collect data year after year after year, and they've started NEON, which is this network of it's called the National Environmental Observatory Network, and the idea is that we begin to collect long-term data so that we're not always being responsive. And so the question is, we don't always know the questions ahead of time. Could you speak a little bit about the value to your own work of these long-term data sets? Because it
Yeah,
seems
that's
to me
really,
like you were really mining, like your perspective is influenced by a long-term data. If you had only had a couple years, or not, I'm just curious as to.
yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, I'm interested broadly in the conditions under which environmental knowledge is produced. So it's somewhat of a second order project, right? In the sense that I learn not only from what the data say, but how the data are formatted and what kinds of questions are asked in a particular period, right? So for me, it was very instructive to see that, well, we didn't get a systematic study of the deltas as ecosystem until the water projects were put in. And before that, we had a whole other kind of regime of knowledge, which of course continued after, but that was all grounded in commercial and to some extent recreational fish markets, right? So looking kind of at that as an archive, but looking at it sideways to see, okay, what are we really getting at? Now, of course, we're in a different regime now, which is all about ecosystem management and climate change preparedness and so on. And then there's new technologies that allow us to collect data in totally different ways. So I could also look, I mean, first of all, I mean, from a policy perspective, I could see why that would be beneficial and might overcome a lot of the problems that the Delta smelt case exemplifies. So that's absolutely true. But from a kind of sociological perspective, what's going on there? Why, what are the conditions that make that kind of knowledge possible? What are the sort of interests at play? That's an interesting question itself. So my other research, which I've talked to you briefly about, I'm interested in the role of artificial intelligence in how that's shaping the way that we see nature and the way that we intervene into nature. But it's a little too early in that project for me to be able to say anything very definitive. I just think it's a very interesting question as to how these new kinds of deployments shape the way that we understand what nature is, and then the kinds of anticipations and responses that we can make. Absolutely crucial.
So Ninian Stein writes, thank you for a wonderful talk. I love the framing analysis of Sean Hannity as an entrepreneur of social division. If students want to work towards improving negotiations and reducing division, what courses or areas of study would you recommend? Like my course.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I don't know if I'm a good example in that regard. I might be just adding to the polarization with this talk. But I think it's good to. So first of all, I think it's important to sort of be clear on what's going on, right? So I think there's a lot of misrecognition in cases like this around a water wars framing, and so it's clear to it's not going to stop the Hannity at all from doing what they're doing, but we should be clear-eyed and understand what the Delta smelt controversy is about when it's on Fox News. It's not about water. It's about articulating division between an us and a them. And that's both a political project, but it's also a business project. It's also in their business model. So in this project, I sort of take as a given that we've inherited this horribly polarized media and partisan landscape, right? And the Delta smelt sort of plops into that. The question of, how do we depolarize? Well, I think that's a broader structural question than the case can really speak to. But there is a lot of really exciting work that's happening right now on the question of polarization within sociology. So, I mean, I guess maybe this is just a plug for my own discipline, but within sociology and within political science and communication studies and so on, and science communication, there's a lot of work, showing tactics for how to avoid sort of falling into these kinds of traps. The trouble is it's deeply structural, right? And so I don't, yes, maybe you can, find better ways of communicating with your relatives or friends who disagree, and that's all well and good. But I'm not I'm not sure I have the magic bullet for how to depolarize. So maybe come back in 5 years when I'm done with my broader study, and I'll have something a little bit more profound to say on that topic. But I think it's more just about how the public sphere has become the way it has, and less about the Delta smelt. Although it's interesting, the environment has become one of the most polarizing areas within the broader polarized landscape, and that wasn't the case even 10 years ago. So for me, understanding that history is crucial before I can really say how to intervene. And there are people working on that, but I want to be among them.
If I could just add a couple of thoughts to that. I mean, so Governor Inslee from Washington State, when he talks, it's not jobs versus the environment, it's jobs and the environment. So his framing is very much a framing around, we're going to be leaders in the transformation of society, which is inevitable. So in some ways, that might be the kind of way of sort of thinking about ways that you can articulate the way that Governor Inslee has, that the environment is actually something that we're all we're in this ride together, and we can make it work to our advantage. That's one thought that I had as you were describing.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, so that's absolutely right. And I think that, well, I don't have data to back this up right now. I think one thing to avoid is to, talk down to people or to treat them as though they're stupid or they don't understand science. I think linking it to issues that people really care about, right? And so, although the Green New Deal has itself become a polarized object, there is an attempt there, as with the Inslee case that you mentioned, to link broad-based economic prosperity, addressing inequality, structural racism, and all these things that we care about, at least many of us care about, with environmental causes. And so at least, maybe it doesn't overcome, right-left polarization, but it can build solidarity among people who are reachable, who might care about a number of different social issues, to see them as not in conflict, right? So this tendency of this kind of Malthusian framework of scarcity and the environment, I think, is one to avoid. And it should be, our focus should be not merely on depolarizing the public sphere, but also on just sort of building a coalition that can win, right? Because there's always going to be people we can't reach. And so I think the Inslee approach is absolutely a good example.
Well, we're out of time. Caleb, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming today. I look forward to meeting with you in person. I can't believe it's been almost 9 months and we still haven't been able to have a cup of coffee, but I look forward to it. And thank you for sharing your wealth of information with our community.
Thank you, Colin and Coco and everyone for attending.